things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for all the books that would be written. Amen. So, these last few verses of this text that John has written, there's a tendency, there's a temptation to look at them and say, those aren't very meaty. Those are just it's just kind of a wrap up. That's just kind of a closing statement. But as I studied this out this week and I spent some time on it, there two things started eating at me that I thought we could maybe dig into a little bit this evening and hopefully answer. One question is, why did John write this gospel? And that might sound like a not particularly interesting question, but hopefully I can convince you otherwise. And then the second question would be, why did he end his gospel with this story? Of all the stories that he could end with, why would he have ended with this story? So we'll just attack the first question. The first question being, why did John write his gospel? John gives us some clues as to why he wrote this gospel in this very text. And in chapter 20 and verse 31, he says quite clearly, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And he tells us in verse 24 of the text that we just read a minute ago, he said, this is the disciple who testifies to these things. Other versions might say he bears witness. And he goes on to say that his testimony is true. And what John's getting at here is that he's saying in chapter 20, he said, I write these so that you will believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And then in chapter 21, he says, and my testimony is true. I'm legit, right? I bore witness to these things. And you might think, well, what's the big deal? We're Christians. Everybody understands Jesus is the Messiah. But I think it's important to understand the context that John was writing this book in. We believe that John's gospel was the latest gospel, and we believe that that it was probably written after maybe 90 A.D. So this is quite some time after, late in the first generation Christian time period. And something that had been creeping in at this time were heresies. And that's a term we're all familiar with, and most of us have heard of Gnosticism. When we read the book of Revelation, chapter 2, when Jesus speaks to the church in Pergamum, he talks about the Nicolaitans. That's referencing a heresy. Maybe you've heard of Docetism. And these are all very complex religious systems that I'm not going to try to explain. You can read about them. And I don't want to over summarize them. They're like I said, they're complex and they're worth looking into if you have any interest in what they're all about. But one of the common things that you would hear come out of these heresies was that Jesus and the Christ were somehow two separate things. There was the human Jesus, and then there was this sort of spiritual entity, which was the Christ. And one story would go that, well, Jesus was born sort of this unassuming, unexpecting man, and at his baptism by John, the Spirit of the Christ came upon him in some fashion, and they coexisted in some way. And then at the crucifixion, this Spirit somehow left him, right? And so these were some of the things that were going on during the time of John. And John is insistent when he says these simple words, Jesus is the Messiah. He wanted his people, he wanted his followers, he wants us to understand that Jesus was totally human and totally divine at the same time. And, this Gnostic idea kind of fits well with sort of the Greek philosophies of the time, this dualism that spirit and flesh are completely separate and they're completely opposite. But to John, as a Jew, the Messiah had to be a person. The Messiah was always going to be a person. The Messiah was going to be someone in the line of David that would come and be a king and rescue his people and lead his people. And so, throughout John's writings, we see him going after this. In the first chapter of the Gospel of John, he says in verse 14, the Word became flesh. He's very intent on this. The word didn't possess somebody or take over someone else's body, but became flesh in and of itself. For the sake of time, I won't have us go there directly, but in 1 John, the first chapter of his letter, he talks about this idea of having seen and having touched and having heard. It's very important to him that we understand that this was a human being, this Messiah. And he goes on in chapter 4 of his first letter, 1 John, and says that he encourages his followers to test the spirits. And if any spirit doesn't agree that Jesus came in the flesh, he specifically says that it's an antichrist, right? And so it's believed that this gospel that we see in John, one of the big purposes for it was to sort of establish this gospel of a God becoming human, humbling himself, lowering himself, taking on the frailty of the flesh and the infirmities that go with it, and dying a physical, painful human death, right? And what John's trying to get at and to establish fully before he passes on himself, he wants everybody to understand that this is not just a religion. This is a relationship. This is a king and a kingdom and a savior, and it's very different. And that's why I think that we see the book of John and his other writings being written the way it is. And before I move on, I'll just kind of touch briefly. Sometimes I'll get on a tangent about something like this, and I'll get challenged with a question. Well, Tim, do I even need to know all this? Why are you telling me these things? And are these salvation issues that you're bringing up right now? And I have to confess that question troubles me a little bit when people say, do I need to know this to be saved, or is this a salvation issue? It sounds like we're asking what we can get from God rather than what we can give to God. It reminds me of Jesus in Matthew 7 when he says, not everybody who says to me, Lord, Lord, will be saved. And there's this idea of people being put out and they're surprised and they say, well, we prophesied and we did all this good religious stuff. Why can't we come in? And he's like, I never knew you. He says, you were looking for some sort of a checkbox thing and a lever that you could pull to be saved, but I was looking for a relationship. I wanted to know you, and I wanted you to know me. And just like John is so passionate about people knowing the truth about Jesus in the flesh, taking on human infirmities, wanting to have a relationship, he wanted to make sure people had a right understanding of what this Jesus thing was all about. And we too need to make sure that our understanding of Jesus is informed by the truth, by the eyewitnesses, by John and the other writers. There's a lot of stuff that you can read and write and hear about Jesus. And some of it's great, but it has to be grounded in the truth of the gospel that John fought so hard to protect as he was writing this gospel. Amen. Just moving on quickly to the next question that I had. And that question was, why would John end his gospel in this fashion? If you think about the other three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all end majestically. Matthew ends with Jesus coming and saying, all authority has been given to me. He's basically announcing the fulfillment of Daniel 7. And then he sends people out on this great commission. It's this charge, and we're so fired up about that. Luke ends his gospel with Jesus ascending into heaven. What beats that, right? That's major. And then Mark, there's some, conflicting ideas about how Mark really ended, but one idea is that it ended with your italicized words where he gives a great commission and ascends into heaven, like in sort of a combination of Luke and Matthew. But even if you go back to the passage before that, you see this suspenseful story of the women, and they're at the tomb and he's not there, and there's this like a cliffhanger ending. Whereas with John, it's this strange, very tame, anticlimactic ending about a little campfire and some fish and a makeup session between Peter and Jesus. And you think, well, why would you end a gospel so anticlimactically? But there's language in here that draws me in to a belief that what John was doing with this story about the reinstatement of Peter is he was drawing us into the larger story of the Bible itself. And we can see that when we contrast Peter with John throughout the book. We have this passage where, on Sunday, Corey preached about the reinstatement of Peter. Peter answers these three questions, and now Jesus knows that he loves him, and he says, okay, you're back in. Now follow me. And by the way, you're going to go to your death. By the way, you're going to be crucified. That's what verse 19 is all about. And in verse 20, we see Peter turn around and he looks at John and says, yeah, but what about him? And I think we have this tendency to judge Peter perhaps a little too harshly there. I think there's a tendency for us to say, you see, Peter's been reinstated and he gets this new call to go and follow Jesus. But instead of just doing what Jesus wants him to do, he's worried about John. Or maybe he's jealous. Or maybe he's saying, well, why do I have to die and John doesn't have to die? Right? But I think there's a lot more to it than that. And I think it can be drawn out when we contrast Peter to John as they appear, in particular in the book of John. When we meet Peter, when we meet Peter early in the book of Mark, for instance, he gets this call: leave your nets and follow me, and he does. He drops everything, follows Jesus. Later in Matthew 19, he himself says, "We've left everything for you." Peter was absolutely a willing disciple from the very beginning, fired up and ready to go. And he showed lots of promise. In Matthew 16, when Jesus was asking, who do people say that I am? And who do you say that I am? It's Peter that stood up and said, you're the Messiah. Amen. You're the Son of God. Right. And Jesus was impressed by that. And he laid out this call on Peter, says, you're the rock, and I'm going to build a church on you. And the gates of Hades will not overcome it. That's like an Old Testament patriarchal blessing that Jesus gave to Peter, and it's very impressive. Peter was willing from the beginning, and he was fired up. But in the book of John, around chapter 13, we start to see him falter, right? We start to see that he's willing, but he's not necessarily ready. In John 13, at the Last Supper, Jesus is telling them, hey, I'm going to go and I'm going to be killed, and where I go, you can't follow. And Peter gets kind of fired up, and he's like, what do you mean I can't follow? I'm going to follow you. I'll follow you to your death. And Jesus has to correct him because Jesus knows that he's not ready yet, and he doesn't have the understanding that he needs to carry this out. And he tells him, you're going to deny me, Peter. You're not ready. And sure enough, later in John 18, we see Peter in the courtyard, and I take that back. In John 18, we see Peter rather in the garden with a sword out, swinging it at people. I mean, there's a Roman cohort, Ed, 1,000 people, 600 people. I mean, there's a ton of people there, soldiers, professionals. Peter's got a sword out. When he said, I will die for you, Jesus, he was serious, but he had a particular kind of death in mind. He didn't have in mind what Jesus had in mind. And Jesus corrects him and says, no, this isn't how it's going to be. And put your sword away. And Jesus goes off and gets arrested, and he goes to trial, and ultimately to his crucifixion. And I tend to believe that that's where Peter's mind, that's where Peter had his breakdown. I've been following this Messiah. He's amazing. He has the words of life. He can do miracles. He's the one that's been prophesied. I'm ready to die for him. I'm ready to do it all. But whoa, now he's arrested. It's like everything has been turned upside down. Everything that I believed in, everything that I had faith in, everything that I put my hope in about this man has changed, and now I don't get it. And then we see him in the courtyard, and he gets questioned. He gets the opportunity to die for Jesus. When that servant girl says, are you his disciple, or you're not his disciple, are you? However it was phrased, he could have, if he'd have said yes, if he had proclaimed, I am his disciple, well, they would have said, fine, we can have 4 crosses tomorrow just as well as we can have 3. And he would have indeed died for Jesus. But he didn't understand. He wasn't ready. He faltered. Peter was the rock, but he was also rocky. In Matthew 16, Jesus talks about him being the rock, and it's seen as a compliment, and surely it was. But just 3 chapters before, in Matthew 13, Jesus tells the story of the soil. And he says that the seed that fell on the rocky soil, and it's the same basic word form as that he gave to Peter as the rock, well, that springs up quickly. But when persecution comes, it falls away immediately. Doesn't that sound like what we see in Peter in the book of John in chapter 19? There's no way Jesus didn't have this whole thing in mind when he said that. I believe that he had that. I love that. But contrast this Peter who's willing but so flawed and so misunderstanding. Contrast him to John, the way we see John portrayed in his gospel. We see John in chapter 13 of the book of John. He's leaning against Jesus, sitting right beside him at the Last Supper. We don't know where Peter is. Jesus says that somebody's going to betray me, and Peter is apparently so far away that he can't ask Jesus directly who it's going to be. He motions to John and has John ask him, or maybe he just wasn't comfortable asking. But we see John with this intimate closeness to Jesus, whereas somehow Peter just isn't experiencing that at the Last Supper. In chapter 18, when Peter goes to try to get into the courtyard of the high priest, he doesn't have the credentials to get in. It says the other disciple has to get him in. And we tend to think that other disciple was John. It doesn't say specifically, but the point is, Peter was lacking, whereas this other disciple had what it took to get in. At the crucifixion in chapter 19, who's there? John, at the foot of the cross. Peter, we don't know where he is at this point. John, he's like shining forth. Chapter 19, verse 27. Who's going to take care of Mother Mary? John. John gets the call, not Peter. In chapter 20, when Mary Magdalene tells them that the tomb is empty, John and Peter take off running, but John's faster. Right? Every time you compare them, you see this difference. John tends to edge forward a little bit. And then even in chapter 21, when they're in the boat and they have the miraculous catch and they see this man on the shore, but nobody knows who he is except John. And it's John that tells Peter, hey, Peter, you know who that is? That's Jesus. And we keep seeing John just kind of edging forth. In comparison, he seems to outshine Peter. And I say all that to say that in verse 20 of the text today, when Peter turns around after being told that he is to follow Jesus to his own crucifixion, and he turns around and looks at John and says, what about him? I don't think he was complaining. I don't think he was trying to get out of it. I don't think he was trying to justify something. I think he was looking back at John and saying, isn't he more deserving of this glory that you're calling me to? The verse 19 says that the crucifixion of Peter is how he would glorify God with his death. And I think Peter, having gone through this restoration with Jesus in a post-resurrected state, he saw the cross very differently. In the courtyard of chapter 18, the cross was something quite awful, quite scandalous, quite humiliating and awful. But in a post-resurrected state, after talking to Jesus and after being reinstated, he saw the cross for what it was. He saw it as the glory of God. And I think he was saying to Jesus, you know how weak I am. You've seen me fail you before. You've heard me say that I would die for you, and then you saw me run. Are you sure you trust me with this destiny, with this calling? Are you really going to bring me back in? What about John? He never failed. He never messed up. Isn't he better? And I think what John's trying to tell us with this story is that this is our God. God doesn't judge the way we judge. And God sticks to his plan. The same God in Jesus who said that the church would be built on Peter the rock. It was that same God that called Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And like Peter was asked to leave everything, Abraham was asked to leave everything. He says to Abraham in chapter 12, verse 1, go from your country, from your people, and from your father's household to a land that I will show you. And Abraham went. He was willing, like Peter was willing. And God blessed Abraham the way Jesus blessed Peter. He said, I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and you are going to bless the world. Just as Peter was told that he would fish for men and have a church built upon him. But like Peter, Abraham faltered. 11 years into his walk with God, with hearing promise after promise that he would be a great nation, that he would have a son of his own, and it would come from Sarah, he and his wife got together and they took matters into their own hands and they abused this Egyptian slave Hagar, and it was an awful story, and it was a failure of readiness. Abraham was willing, like Peter, to follow God, but he wasn't ready to do it his way. But God, in his faithfulness, blessed them with a son, Isaac, anyway. The faithlessness of Abraham and Sarah was not able to thwart his plan, just like the faithlessness of Peter in the courtyard was not able to thwart the crucifixion and the resurrection. But just as Jesus had to come back around and bring Peter back in, God came back around to bring Abraham back in, because God's not just concerned with his mission, he's also concerned with his people, right? Isaac was born, the seed was established, the people of Israel would come, but God had to reconcile with Abraham. And in chapter 22, he says, hey, come on, we're going to the mountain. We're going to try this again. I want you to sacrifice this son that I've given you. And this new Abraham, who'd seen the miracle of his son Isaac's birth, goes in with a different kind of faith. And he's poised to go through with this. And of course, the angel stops him and says, now I know. Now I know that you fear me. You know, and I imagine Jesus sitting around that fire with Peter after asking him 3 times, do you love me? And seeing the excruciating restoration, and Jesus thinking, now I know. Now I know that you love me. Come follow me. You know, Peter and Abraham, they had to be tested. You know, they had to persevere through their failures. They had to persevere through their trials. And I think what John's trying to tell us here with this seemingly anticlimactic story is that this is the story of God's people. This is the story of God. God is a God of mission. God is a God of purpose. And God calls people to do things that they're not up to just yet.
Amen.
But he will take us there if we follow him. Peter was placed into the story of Abraham. What an honor. And you and I, all of us, we demonstrated our willingness when we said Jesus is Lord. But the truth is, like Peter, like Abraham, we've been called into something that's way bigger than we are. Amen. We've been called into something that in and of ourselves we're not quite up for. But if we stay willing and we persevere through failure and trial and doubt and hardship, despite all of our shortcomings and our lack of understanding, God will indeed glorify himself through us. Amen. Thank you very much.
Amen. Hey, Tim, thanks so much. That was fantastic. And what a great way for us to see ourselves in the most beautiful story, the gospel story, and God's patience with us, but his desire for relationship despite all of our shortcomings and, boy, oh boy, all of the vagaries of the way that we have determination to follow, but yet so many other things that get in the way of that. But yet there God is, patient with us and still excited for us to eventually connect fully and be aligned with him. We're going to finish our fast with some prayer in just a moment. There's one announcement that I neglected to make earlier, and that is that next week we will have our Tuesday midweek. We're going to be doing something that will include one of the other regions. And it's going to be a lot of fun, and we'll be all connected, and we're going to lay out some of the stuff that's going to happen in May next Tuesday. But on top of that, the singles church-wide, all of the singles church-wide, are going to have midweek on Wednesday. So singles all throughout the church. You're, of course, welcome to be at ours. It's not the biggest investment on earth to, flip the